All right. Hi, everybody. I think we'll get started now. We're at noon, and I'm sure we'll have a few more people joining us as we go, but that's all right. Thank you so much for coming. My name's Jen Terry. I'm the Executive Director for Defining Moments Canada. Um, Defining Moments Canada is very excited to be hosting this webinar with the Juno Beach Centre Association, and we're very grateful for the support of Project 44 and the Canadian War Museum and Veterans Affairs Canada to help us get here today. Defining Moments is dedicated to equipping teachers and students and the Canadian public with tools and resources that needed to curate stories in our modern world. And this webinar is one of the ways that we're trying to adapt to continue doing that as we're all forced to reconsider how we participate in education, commemoration, and storytelling in the age of COVID-19. The webinar is an adapted culmination of a lot of hard work on the VEday 75 Normandy to Netherlands project. It was always intended to be a national digital commemoration, but as we've been forced into our homes, we wanted to go a step further to ensure that the commemoration wouldn't be forgotten in the midst of life during a pandemic. The project builds upon work completed last year in commemoration of the 75th anniversary of D-Day and Canadians landing on Juno Beach. We're proud to have developed these resources with the support of Veterans Affairs Canada and the rest of our partners, and to be able to continue offering opportunities for our audiences to participate in digital commemoration. Working with our partners, we've built an impressive suite of resources that share outstanding Canadian stories, including historical articles, story maps, and a virtual exhibit. We're excited for the opportunity to be sharing these with you today, along with the important historical context of Canadians during the liberation of the Netherlands. The current social circumstances caused by the threat of COVID-19 have drastically shifted how we participate in commemoration and education. This year marks 75 years since Victory in Europe Day and the end of the Second World War. For many Canadians, this means commemorating the liberation of the Netherlands and marking the special relationship that still exists between our two countries. Major events in Canada and the Netherlands have had to be cancelled that were organized to honor the veterans and to honor those who had died. Commemoration is generally very public and it's very personal. We do it socially, we gather in groups to remember, and the sharing is a really important part of the experience, but the remembering is personal and it takes place inside of us. So we've organized this webinar to help share the story of Canada's finest hour with Canadians, and also to try to rethink how we share the experience of commemoration while we're socially isolated. A quick note for housekeeping, I'll be active in the chat throughout the webinar, trying to post resources that are referenced and collect any questions that are asked. We'll be finishing up with a Q&A session at the very end, where you'll be able to ask questions of any of our panelists or about the digital resources discussed. So post them throughout or post them at the end, and we will try to get everything answered we can. We'll be circulating a recording of the webinar afterwards. So if you miss anything, don't worry. Now I will introduce you to Alex Fitzgerald Black. In addition to being the Operations and Outreach Manager for the Juno Beach Centre, Alex is an accomplished historian in his own right, and he's author of Eagles Over Husky, the Allied Air Forces in the Sicilian Campaign. So he is wonderfully qualified to be leading this discussion, and I will hand it right over to him.
Thank you very much, Jen. Welcome everybody to VEday. Very much for joining us. Let's begin by going over an outline of the webinar that will take us through the next half. First up, we have a historian roundtable with representation from Defining Moments Canada, the Juno Beach Centre, and the Canadian War Museum. I will be asking our three historians, who I will formally introduce in a moment, questions that take us on a journey with the Canadian Army from Normandy to the Netherlands. Next, we will have a resource roundtable whereby Project 40 Moments Canada will be unveiling tools for remembrance in a digital age. Finally, we will have a recap and wrap up where I'll turn things back over to Jen and to you for questions and answer period. So it's my pleasure to introduce our historian roundtable. And if they can unmute themselves, we can get started. I will introduce them in speaking order. We have consulting historian for Defining Moments Canada. Mike is a historian, author, and battlefield tour leader who specializes in Canada in the First and Second World Wars. Next, we have Marie-Ève Vaillancourt, the ex-manager at the Juno Beach Center Association. Marie-Ève has been with the Juno Beach Center almost 9 years. She completed a Master of Education on the topic of memory transmission at the University of Caen and holds a BA in History from Carleton University. Finally, Dr. Tim Cook is the Acting Director of Research at the Canadian War Museum. He is the author and editor of 13 books, including his 3-volume history of Canada and the Second World War. The books are called The Necessary War, Fight to the Finish, and his newest book is The Fight for History. Thank you to all 3 of you for making time to be with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So Mike, I was going to start with you. Could you set the scene for us in Europe during 44?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Jen, and especially thanks to Neil Orford for setting up this whole webinar today. It's a really good initiative. The spring of 1944 was a really key period in the history of the Second World War. It was kind of a make or break time. As everybody knows, the Second World War hadn't gone very well for the Western Allies up until that point. For Canada, we joined the war in September 19. And it bears repeating that we joined it of our own free will. Canadians at the time thought that joining this war was necessary and the right thing to do. We weren't attacked. We weren't going to be directly attacked, but Canadians saw that we needed to go and help the UK and help France and join this great war. The war didn't start well for Canada. Hong Kong in December 41 and Dieppe in August 42 weren't very good, but the Canadian Army was getting ready to, and until that happened, it was the RCAF and the Royal Canadian Navy that were really carrying the war. The RCAF started to take bombing missions over Germany, and the Royal Canadian Navy was absolutely key in the Battle of Atlantic to make sure that resources got over to England and the country wasn't choked off and knocked out of the war before anything really started. Why did all this take place? Why was this important? And I think it's good to point to Anne Frank, somebody that all Canadians know, who was a young Jewish girl from Amsterdam who kept a diary to tell us of her thoughts while she was in Amsterdam, hiding from the Nazis who threatened to take all Jews to concentration camps. In January 1943, she noted in her diary, "I could go on for hours about all the suffering the war has brought, but then I would only make myself more. Nothing we can do but wait as calmly as we can till this misery comes to an end. Jews and Christians wait. The whole earth waits, and there are many who wait for death." These words seem all the more poignant today in our COVID-19 world, but it really was a life or death struggle for Anne Frank and her family. And as we all know, they wouldn't survive that conflict. So the Canadians didn't know about the Holocaust at the time, but it really put everything in perspective when they finally did. In the spring of 1944, the Canadian Army, the British Army, the American Army, and all their allies were getting ready to go back to Europe. The armies were sitting in the UK. They were ready, trained, and prepared to launch the second front. Of course, we were already in Sicily and into the boot of Italy, but Western Europe was seen as the real way to defeat Germany. So that's where we are right now, and I'll leave it to Marie-Ève to take it on from there.
Thank you very much, Mike. Marie-Ève, what was Canada's role on D-Day and in the Battle of Normandy?
So yeah, D-Day gets a lot of attention. We kind of, zero in on that event and conceive of it as sort of the beginning of the end, where in fact, as Mike has evoked, there's a context, and sometimes we mistake the successes of D-Day for okay, and then the Second World War ended. So I'll take a moment to go over this event, following the maps and the photos that we've assembled here, it's obviously unprecedented in world history, this amphibious landing that captivates our imagination even up to this day. And I want to impress, kind of following on what Mike has just evoked, that at this time, by 1944, Canadians have been at war since 1939. We've been heavily involved in the Battle of the Atlantic, keeping Britain supplied. We've sustained the brutal losses of Dieppe, and we've been fighting in Italy since 1943. So my point being that, as Mike mentioned, this is a volunteer effort. So it is a crucial tipping point, but we've strained our resources quite a bit by then, by 1944. And we're definitely going to be punching above our weight from Juno Beach on to Victory. And again, I want to remind everyone, this is a volunteer army with no conscription for overseas service. So our role on D-Day is to take basically the second most well-defended beaches of all 5 beaches assigned to the Allies. We're right next to the British and the Americans further up. But our main role is going to be largely Army on that day, armor and artillery units, coordinating to destroy the first and the second lines of defense. We're seeing on the map here the 2 main red lines being our immediate D-Day objectives, and the dotted lines where we actually reach inland further areas on the beaches of D-Day. So this close coordination between these army, infantry, army, and armor will annihilate the immediate defenses, but essentially that means that in one, we are able to overcome what was built for over 4 years, the famous Atlantic Wall. So that's an incredible achievement, obviously. We will sustain losses that are well below 10% of the total fighting force that's sent in that day. So out of 14,000 Canadians who land, we will lose 359 killed in action for that 8-kilometer of beachfront. I'm not mentioning the role of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, which is away from Juno Beach. But this is to say that it's a successful day, and a little bit like it's the beginning of the end at this point. We really want to consider the fact that by midnight of that day, yes, we've made it further inland than any other Allied troops on that day, but German reinforcements are fast arriving. Those that can make it to Normandy are elite troops, comprised of, well, later on we will be facing 2 German divisions of armor. And essentially, what happens after D-Day lasts a couple of months. It will be the place within which we will send 90,000 Canadians, and it will cost a total of 5,500 lives to fight over this country and reach and encircle essentially the German army in Normandy. It's an often inglorious and overlooked task at this point. I do want to mention the work that Dr. Mark Milner has done in shedding some light recently on our role after D-Day and facing German armored divisions and making us sometimes perceived as being slower than the other Allied forces in Normandy. So by the time we get out of Normandy, we've essentially sent the German army fleeing back and organizing their next lines of defenses. But all the major deep water ports that you're all seeing on this map, after Dieppe, obviously, which we liberate in September of 1944, quite symbolically. We have Boulogne, Dunkirk, Calais. These are all deep water ports that the Germans don't necessarily want to hold, give back to the Allies. They're essential in making our own armies well supplied. So at this point, there's a lot of destruction that happens in those areas, heavy bombardments to destroy these cities, and a lot of French civilian deaths occur because of this. And I'll probably jump back into that point later as I describe our role with the Dutch. But I think I'm going to hand it over to Alex to continue. Oh, I just want to mention at this point, the last photo you had up, Alex, where we're seeing three men chatting. This is a great photo just because it indicates in the caption that they were original D-Day veterans at this point, entering in the fall and the winter of 1945. So the Canadians experienced losses, and for most of the units, let's say you have a platoon of 30 men, by the time they roll into the Netherlands, there's only 2 or 3 of them left that are D-Day originals, and that's something to ponder about. I'm going to leave it at that for now.
Thanks very much, Mary-Eve. Mike, can you expand on this? How were the Canadians employed as the Allies approached the German border?
Yeah, absolutely. So in October and November, as Mary-Eve mentioned, the Canadians were involved in opening the Scheldt estuary. The port of Antwerp was the largest port in all of Europe, and the Canadians the British had captured it in early September, but it required all the fighting in October for the Canadians to open the estuary, the river that led to the port of Antwerp. And that was one of the biggest Canadian campaigns of the war. After that, in November, December, and January, the Canadian Army was pretty much out of the war. They were recuperating, finding replacements, training up those men to get back into the battle. The great Battle of the Bulge that's been so famous, and the Battle of, or the Band of Brothers television series. The Canadians missed that just because of where we were. The only Canadian troops that really took part were a cameo from some men from the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion that were put into the line for a brief period. But after that, the next major Canadian battle was going to be in the Rhineland. And this was one of the key battles of the Second World War. We were not liberating anymore, we were conquering. We were attacking Germany head on. And German defenses changed considerably as we got deeper into Germany, because once again, they weren't defending what they had captured, they were defending their homeland, and that really changed the nature of their fighting. 1st Canadian Army under General Curator was one of the major formations that was fighting at this point, and the 1st Canadian Army that was under the command of the Canadian was one of the largest formations that was ever under the command of one Canadian general in our history. Now, the fighting in the Rhineland is often seen as just a way to get to the battles of Holland, the liberation of Holland, but it was a really major fight. And we today know that the war ended in May 1945, 2 months away from the fighting in March. So why were we really fighting anymore at this point? Wasn't the war over? Didn't we have to do it? I like to use the comparison of the bombing of Dresden, which is often pointed to as one of the great war crimes committed by the Allies in the Second World War, that this firebombing of a German city that took place on the 13th to 14th of May never needed to happen because the war was almost over. There was really no need to continue this level of thing. But that's really a hindsight view, 2020 hindsight kind of perspective. We know the war was over, but nobody at the time knew that it was over. Everybody knew the war was winding down, but they didn't know if it was going to last another month, another 2 months, and they had to keep fighting hard right until the end. On the 13th and 14th, while Dresden was being bombed, the Canadians were in the middle of the fighting in the Hochwald Forest in the Rhineland, and it was some of the nastiest, most costly fighting the Canadians experienced during the entire Second World War. And if you'd asked any Canadian soldier on the front line that day, they would have said, the war's not over. This is the toughest fighting we've yet faced. So everybody had to keep fighting right until the end because nobody knew when that would be. I'll pass it back to Alex, and we'll talk about the liberation of the Netherlands.
Mary-Eve, I'll turn this over to you. Could you speak to the role of Canadian troops in liberating the Dutch people?
Yes. So just like in Normandy and the northern coast of France and Belgium, Canadians obviously liberated very happy civilians. And despite a lot of destruction, homes, livelihoods, and neighborhoods, there is still a huge sense of gratefulness to be freed from Nazi occupation and oppression. So what really distinguishes our role with the Dutch is that prior to Holland, the moments spent with grateful civilians, liberated people, were short-lived and fairly intense, but our role was to move on and press on and not stay. So what differs in the Netherlands, and I think that's what it's at the heart of this enduring relationship that we're still witnessing 75 years later, is that we spent a lot more time in Holland than we did, double the time really. And we have to consider that our troops, especially by March of 1945 in the final months, are coming right up from Italy and join up. We have the largest fighting Canadian force ever amassed into this territory for quite a bit of time. So logically, if you share daily life, especially the hardships, and you have a greater amount of troops over a longer period of time, you have the time to forge the bonds that we're still witnessing today. And a factor for this is that, as I mentioned before, we heavily bombarded the coast of northern France, and it posed a dilemma, much like Mike has mentioned. We have the benefit of hindsight with looking at these events, but by the time the Allies were into Holland, there was a really an effort made to spare as many civilian lives as possible, and the nature of the fight in above sea level countries was entirely different. So again, less bombarding of Dutch civilians than French civilians for sure. And by the time that we have Operation Faust in the spring of 1945, we actually are doing an operation that is not military at all, but is purely organized around bringing food and relief and supplies to a population that was literally starving to death. We have to remember that 20,000 Dutch people actually died of starvation in that winter. So that Operation Faust plays a big role in seeing that we're not just there to fight a war, we are, but we're taking into consideration that civilian populations desperately need help, and we supply that. So that's essentially, I think, what solidifies the relationship and leaves an imprint on the Dutch population. Even today, when we hear of our veterans speaking of their most remarkable moments in the war, they all make sense to them when they saw Dutch children being freed and being happy, and the level of desperation, it kind of all came together for them. So yeah, this is a little bit of what we try to evoke in the slide that you're seeing with our Maple Leaves and Tulips exhibition that we have online, which was largely inspired by Dean Oliver's work way back in quite a few years ago, where he worked on a book called Tulips and Maple Leaves. So we just switched it around and called it Maple Leaves and Tulips, but it's not a new concept, and a book that Dean Oliver and the Canadian War Museum worked on that was a good milestone in that relationship. So
thank you very much, Mary-Eve. Let me just change my slide. There we go. So Tim, over to you now. I went one too far, didn't I? Why did the Canadian collective memory of the Second World War diminish in the post-1945 era?
Well, thanks, Alex, and thanks to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. We just heard about the enormous fighting, the strain, the service, the sacrifice of Canadians from D-Day and before that in Italy and around the world. I've always been struck by Canada's global commitment. The 100,000 Canadians in the Italian campaign, the Battle of the Atlantic, Canadians in the Pacific, 2 RCF squadrons there, supplying Burma, Hong Kong, Dieppe. These are incredible stories. The Battle of the Atlantic, absolutely crucial to victory. We had 1.1 million Canadians in uniform. That's from a country of 11.5 million. Speaking to a journalist last week about that, he said, well, that can't be right. There couldn't have been 1.1 million in uniform. And I said, yes, indeed. This was a necessary war. This was a war that had to be fought. Canadians understood it at the time, and I think they understand it today. And in fact, I wrote 2 volumes on this, The Necessary War and Fight to the Finish. And as I was touring the country, I heard 2 things. One, people thanking me for telling these stories, and that was very grateful, speaking to veterans, speaking to their children and their grandchildren and others interested in history. But others saying, why didn't I know this story? Why didn't I know about Canada's commitment? And that's what my new book is about, The Fight for History. It's been delayed until September, but I really wanted to look at why we didn't talk more about the Second World War. Not to celebrate it uncritically, but simply to acknowledge Canada's enormous service in that war. And I think part of it was when the veterans came back, we treated them very well. The Veterans Charter was one of the most forward-thinking sets of legislation in our history, much like the GI Bill. I think many listeners now and viewers know it. It sent 45,000 Canadian veterans to universities. There were loans for small businesses, for houses. Canada was moving forward. We were moving forward with prosperity, and we left the war behind. We didn't memorialize it in the same way. Think of the Great War. Think of how that affected us. The 66,000 dead from that war traumatized our nation. Now, there were 45,000 killed from the Second World War, so it should have lain heavy, I think, across Canada, the social memory of the country, deep wells of grief. And yet, we didn't memorialize it in the same way. Think of Vimy and Beaumont-Hamel. Think of the National Monument in Ottawa. We didn't build another monument to our Second World War veterans, even though, as I recount in my new book, they wanted one. They demanded one in 1945. The government of the day said no to them. When they came back, veterans again 10 years later saying, we need a national monument. The government went ahead, but eventually it was canceled in the 1960s. We accepted the symbols of the First World War, the poppy, Remembrance Day, John McCrae, 2 minutes of silence. All of these symbols come from that war. Of course, they mean now much more, and I think we think of all veterans with those symbols, and yet the Great War continued to dominate. And finally, and I talk about more in the book, but finally I think we let the Americans and the British make the films and write the novels and tell the stories. Mike alluded to that with Saving Private Ryan, but The Longest Day, The Great Escape. Not only were Canadians written out of those stories, they took the Canadian parts of the stories and made it into American or British. So we didn't do a good job for decades in telling our story. And then that story faded. And I think by the 1980s, those who knew about the war really, it was seen through the lens of Dieppe and the forced relocation of Japanese Canadians, one of defeat and disgrace. And all of the victories, the service, and the sacrifice that we are talking about today were largely forgotten.
Tim, thank you for that answer. And you brought us to the next point, which is, well, in the next 30 years after that, how was the Second World War's importance gradually restored in the Canadian mainstream?
Yeah, I think it has restored. I think we've gone through a process of forgetting and then remembering. And I do think the low point was in the early 1990s with The Valor and the Horror, the 3-part NFB film, which really highlighted defeat and disgrace, and veterans reacted very strongly to that. It was seen as an attack on the memory of their fallen comrades, and it was seen as bad history. And I think coming out of that, the 50th anniversary really matters. These anniversaries matter. We're here at the 75th. It's a critical period. The 50th was also a key event, and you'll remember thousands of veterans going back to France, and then the next year in the Netherlands, and being greeted as those liberators that they were. And Canadians woke up to that. That was on national TV, broadcast live from the beaches and then the Netherlands. It was really a key event. And I see it from there that Canadians beginning to pay more attention to what Canada did during the Second World War. We know that veterans took it upon themselves to raise money and to build the Juno Beach Center. It's astonishing to me that before this, we did not have a bricks and mortar presence there. The Canadian War Museum also, where I'm very lucky to work, opened in 2005. I think there's more to be done, but we're moving in the right direction. I guess sadly, I say that we do this now at the 75th when we are down to 30,000 or fewer Second World War veterans, and we're moving towards a period where will we be losing all of our veterans? And I wonder what is incumbent upon us who have benefited from what they did 75 years ago. How will we remember? How will we keep this memory alive?
And there's an added strand to that as well this year. I mean, it always blows my mind that out of 1.1 million Canadians who served, we are now down to fewer than a number of veterans that is fewer than the number who were killed during the war, far fewer now. But what challenges in the pandemic environment we exist in does that pose to present day efforts to commemorate Canada's finest hour? And I'll let Mike, Mary-Eve, and Tim each respond to that on their time in that order.
Thanks, Alex. These are certainly strange times we find ourselves in, and it's a challenge for normal events. I know I was in Normandy last summer for the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and it was an amazing experience, collective memory, everybody showing up to honor the veterans themselves being there. And it's a really big, impressive set of ceremonies that were taking place. Obviously, that can't take place this year. I know there was similar activities planned for the Netherlands this year, and that would have been amazing. And probably the biggest loss there is that we can't show our give our thanks to the veterans in person. But I think there's also an opportunity here, because it means that we have to rejig our commemorations. We have to rethink how we think about the war and commemorate the war. And I think what we're doing today is an example of how these kind of things can take place, even though our world has changed. We can do things online. We can collect, even if we have to isolate ourselves, we can collect virtually and still remember, still honor, still mark, still remember.
Mm-hmm. I think it's great opportunities right now, because we often fear that the younger generations or the generations in between don't understand, and yet it gets past a little bit. But right now, this context allows us to relate better. If we don't understand the Second World War, don't know much about it, and are experiencing our own restrictions right now, our own sacrifices, our own desire to help others, I think it creates the right terrain to better relate to what was experienced in the Second World War. So in that sense, it creates a bridge right now to better relating when you don't know much about the Second World War, which is where a lot of people still sit. If focusing on better showcasing the stories of resilience that countless veterans experienced during the war, and then it creates a way to relate to that right now as we experience our own restrictions. And I've seen a lot of those kinds of things that you were showing us on our slide right now, Alex, on social media, making parallels, realizing that what we're experiencing right now pales in comparison to what people had to endure. We've been in confinement for a couple of weeks, and this war lasted years. So I think it allows us right now to better connect to the profound humility and the profound hopes that that generation held inside of themselves to get through this and get it done and over with, much like how we feel right now. So it's relatability right now is at a better level in my mind.
And to you, Tim.
I guess as a final thought, I would say that history doesn't just exist. We need to actively remember. We must work at it. And I thank the 219 participants I see here that you are actively remembering today and learning and thinking about it. And I hope not uncritically, that there are tough questions we must ask of war and when we send Canadians into war. And yet anniversaries and days like this are perhaps times to reflect upon the incredible service of those Canadians who did so much for us. I'd be remiss to say that if I didn't draw some attention to the Canadian War Museum, where I'm very proud to have worked for 20 years. We're coming up to our 15th anniversary in 3 days on the 8th of May. We've had about 10 million visitors come through the doors. And I think that's been an important site of memory for Canadians. So too is the Juno Beach Center and other organizations. And there will be a small film that drops on the 8th of May. I'll be talking about the memory of the war. And my colleague, Dr. Melanie Morin-Peltier, will be talking as well in French. So you may want to look for that. And I also curated an exhibition, Forever Changed, which has been delayed, of course, but we hope will be open by the end of the year. So we're working at this, and I think we have to work at it. I guess as a final thought, I will say that through my study of Canadian military history over 25 years, I think it's our job to tell our story. This is our history. It's our shared history. It brings us together. It tears us apart. It is a history that instills pride. It is one that can lead to great grief, and yet it's our story. And we leave it to the Americans and the British and the French and the Germans. Don't be surprised if they don't tell our story. We must do it. We must do it now. We must do it every day. And I think this is a message that is driven home to me on special days like this, the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the Dutch. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that, Tim. And thank you, Mike, Tim, and Mary-Eve, for taking us from Juno Beach to the present day in such a short time. I think maybe the Dutch are the only country that I would trust with telling our story a little bit. They seem to do a good job at it. Let me get forward in my slides here. All right. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I wanted to take a moment to note that our resource roundtable is next, and they're going to be unveiling the VEday 75 Normandy to Netherlands educational resources. So VEday 75 Normandy to Netherlands is a national commemorative project supported by the Government of Canada and Veterans Affairs Canada. It aims to share the stories of Canadian contributions to the liberation of Holland and victory in Europe. The project is based on 3 pillars, which you can see in front of you. For education, the project includes educational resources designed to guide students in the creation of commemorative projects that examine Canadian stories of service and sacrifice that built the better world that we inhabit today. Digital storytelling is another pillar. So basically, drawing from extensive research and digital archives curated by the Canadian Research and Mapping Association, or project44.ca, Defining Moments Canada hosts a bilingual national commemorative project on its website to inspire young Canadians to discover the lives and contributions of those who participated in some of Canada's most important battles from Normandy to the Netherlands. We'll actually showcase one of these stories in a short time in the webinar. The third pillar is 21st century commemoration. Our collaboration with the exciting new digital story mapping tools from project44.ca makes VEday 75 a revolution in how Canadians understand and share their history. We're trying to give students resources so that they can act as citizen curators, each crafting their own commemorative project informed by their own research. Here we go. So I'll introduce our resource roundtable panelists here today. Let me get my script back up here. Ugh. Keeps running around on me. There we are. So joining us are 3 members of our project team. We have Drew Hainan, co-founder and vice president of the Canadian Research and Mapping Association. He'll begin by sharing with you the work his organization is doing at project44.ca. Next, you'll hear from Anna England, our VEday 75 Normandy to Netherlands project coordinator. She will take us on a journey in the footsteps of Charles Bice. Finally, Craig Bumwell, an award-winning teacher and the education lead for this project, will present a lesson plan that uses resources curated on the Defining Moments Canada website. So first, I'll turn things over to Drew so he can showcase the power of Project 44.
Thanks, Alex. Just wanted to take the opportunity to thank everybody for inviting Project 44 to this panel. It's a great opportunity to showcase our project and a great opportunity to showcase where Canadians are at for 21st century commemoration. Just wanted to give a little background about the project. So the project, our initiative started 2.5 years ago when co-founder and executive director Nathan Kehler and I met at the Library and Archives, motivated by a common interest in World War II maps. We sort of envisioned a project that would allow Canadians to follow step by step where their relatives, their grandfather, their uncles served every single day of the campaign from D-Day to VEday. So you can see now I've shared our newest build of the web map. You can see here the time slider is set on D-Day, and you can see that bright red icon. It would be 3rd Division getting on the beaches and getting ready to make that push inland, as Mary-Eve was talking about earlier. So we mapped over about 236 days of combat during the project, and we were able to launch with on time last year for the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and this year we're going to be able to launch the second initiative that is going to be the following campaign, the Road to Liberation, the journey from Normandy up to the Scheldt and up through the liberation of Holland. I can just show you here, this is an example of what the front lines looked like on today, 75 years ago. You can see the Canadians in bright red are fighting their way through Western Netherlands, and 2 Corps fighting its way up into Germany. It's a really good resource to get that whole sort of context of what the European theater of operations looks like. So one of the key features that we have for Project 44 is an immense level of interactivity. As you can see, there's a menu on the side which showcases the different layers available to users. You can turn on and off front lines. You can geotag photos. You can turn those off, and you can turn on and off or store the story maps that have been created. So we also have the ability to filter through the extensive amount of data that we have collected over this initiative. There's roughly over 65,000 points of data, which allows you to toggle in between your interests. So if you're only interested in, say, what the Canadians were doing or Americans were doing or the Brits were doing, you can do that. And if you're interested in what, particularly the role of the armored and infantry soldiers, armored soldiers had, you can turn off all icons just to see what the state looked like at the end of the Second World War, and see how many armored divisions were fighting right up until right up until VEday. You can see that the Germans were decimated in terms of how their army was looking, and they had limited amount of resources and almost limited resources in Northern Holland, relying more on sort of coastal battery soldiers to do the fighting. So another feature that we have here is the War Diaries tab, which allows you to click on a particular unit. We have about 118 units going to go live shortly, but if you were to click on one of these units, you'll be able to zoom into that particular unit and read what was transcribed in the unit's war diary for that particular day. So it's a great resource. I was just doing some preliminary calculations. There's over 2.8 million words that have been converted into text through this project, and over 7,000 pages of war diary narratives. So we owe a lot to our volunteers who help us sustain these ambitious efforts, but at the same time, it's a resource that's accessible to all Canadians. So just transitioning into, as Mike was talking about, the push into Germany, we have here one of the featured stories in the VEday 75 story map series talks about the Lake Superior Regiment. The Lake Superior Regiment in early March, late February, was participating in Operation Blockbuster, which is a drive deeper into the German territory over the Rhine to conquer German areas, right? So you can see here the Lake Superior Regiment. If you scroll through all of the War Diaries tab, you can follow them day by day and see exactly what was written for that day, as well as click on other units around there and see their War Diary narrative. Another interesting perspective is the amount of the ability for users to manipulate the map. So another tab here that shows a sort of a 45-degree perspective of the Lake Superior Regiment as they would have fought their way through the Hockwald Gap into the community. Forget the name of the town on the other side, but you can really get a sense of perspective when they talk about the gap is this area in between two huge forests, that was heavily defended by the Germans, and that allows us to sort of transition into the next section of this initiative. And Anna's going to explore one of the featured stories of VEday 75, which is the story of Corporal Charles Bice, who won his Distinguished Conduct Medal for the events in the Hockwald Gap.
All right. Hi,
Yeah,
yeah, sorry. Just gonna pop on my screen there. Hello everyone. As Alex had introduced before, my name is Anna England, and I am the project coordinator for VEday 75, Canada's Finest Hour. So for the past several months, I've had the pleasure of working with this amazing team and amazing talent as well, who have all contributed on this initiative to commemorate. The result of everyone's hard work is an inspiring, commemorative, and educational collection of resources that will help solidify and promote the history of Canada's contribution to the liberation of the Netherlands at the end of the Second World War. So I'd just like to begin by giving everyone a quick overview of the VEday 75 website. The main landing page goes into more detail about the project, its purpose, and the available resources. As you can see on the right-hand bar over here, we have a series of selections that you can pick. The first are the three major stories of resilience that we have here. So we have Charles Bice, Mona Parsons, and Philip Picallo, who are the big three stories of resilience that VEday 75, as a team, we chose to highlight. Within each of their pages, you will find detailed historical accounts of their lives, as well as further resources to consult. There's also exciting 30-second short films that summarize their lives that we have done as a team. And they're very engaging and exciting videos that just summarize these amazing stories. How we were able to summarize them in 30 seconds is impressive. So below those 3 stories, we have the virtual exhibit as well. So the virtual exhibit, this here will show. So within this page is the retelling of the history of Canada's role in liberating the Netherlands at the end of 1944 and beginning of 1945. So we presented the history with the use of primary source photographs, videos, and photos of artifacts as well. You can explore the virtual exhibit through by date or by location. And the exhibit intertwines the history of, with the experiences of the big 3 stories of resilience mentioned earlier, as well as 6 soldiers' stories, which are, each of the soldiers played different roles in the lead up to VEday, but each of their stories is enthralling and inspirational. For example, we have Mo Hurwitz, Leo Megere, who liberated Zwolle, Anthony Law, who is a war artist. We have Don White, Don Somerville, Earl Olmsted. So we have a lot of amazing resources for everyone. Below the exhibit as well, we have the more thorough history of the 1st Canadian Army's participation in the Netherlands. So from the race to Antwerp in September of 1944 through the Battle of the Scheldt, the Rhineland Campaign, and eventually liberation in 1945, in April 1945, Dr. Bechtold has done an outstanding job of covering the history and also delves into topics such as aftermath, occupation, resistance, as well as the history of the 3 branches of the Canadian Armed Forces. So if you're looking for a more thorough, detailed historical account, you can go through here and you can explore all of the amazing resources in the description that Dr. Bechtold has shared. So finally, below the historical context pages, you will find our VEday 75 story maps. We have taken the big 3 stories of resilience, and with the expertise and digital mapping skills of Project 44, we turn their stories into interactive maps so you can follow along with their journey. To show everyone an example, this is Charles Bice's story map here. So, Charlie Henry Bice is one of Canada's most distinguished decorated Indigenous soldiers from the Second World War. He was born in Chapleau, Ontario in 1916 and was the 5th child of Louisa sailors of the Cree First Nations from Moose Factory, Ontario, and Henry Bice, a white Canadian from Westmeath, Ontario. Henry Bice, Charlie's father, also notably joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force during the First World War, and he earned a Distinguished Conduct Medal and the French Médaille Militaire. At a young age, Charles Bice was placed in the residential school system at St. John's Residential School in Chapleau. He survived St. John's, and despite his painful experiences, he went on to fight for Canada in the Second World War with honor and with bravery. In 1944, Charles went on and joined the Lake Superior Regiment. He often risked his life to ensure the safety of his men. Charles landed in Normandy in July 1944 and made his way with his regiment into the Netherlands. In January 1945, he earned his military medal when he protected his fellow servicemen from an enemy attack while they crossed the Maas River. Another view of that with the project maps. As part of Operation Churchill, Charles then went on to earn his Distinguished Conduct Medal in March of 1945, when, during the aptly named Operation Churchill, after an intense artillery battle, he shielded the few remaining men of his regiment as they escaped under enemy sniper. Charles survived the war and returned to Canada and settled down in Espanola, Ontario with his wartime bride, Frances de Glace. He died in 1944 at the age of 78, and in 2008, he and his father were inducted into the Canadian Veterans Hall of Valor. So this is a very brief tour of our story mapping tool. We have the same amazing technology for Philip Picalo, who was a Canadian Air Force pilot who was shot down over the Netherlands and had to go into hiding from the Nazis with the age of the Dutch resistance. And another story map for Mona Parsons, a Canadian living in the Netherlands who hid downed Allied airmen until she was arrested and became the only Canadian woman to be tried and sentenced to death by a Nazi tribunal before she escaped and returned to Canada. So we have all these amazing story maps for those, and we have story maps as well for the 6 soldier stories. They won't be as detailed as these ones, but they're still excellent resources and can show you a geographical plot of how the soldiers move through Europe. So the final component of our VEday 75 project is the engaging lesson plans created by Craig Bumwell. To do those proper justice, however, I will have to pass it off to him. I hope everyone is enjoying Canada's finest hour, VEday 75 from Normandy to Netherlands. It was a delight to work on this project, and I hope our audience is captivated with the final product as we are. So thank you to everyone, and stay safe and stay healthy.
Hi, everybody. My name is Craig Bumwell. I'm a teacher at Kitsilano Secondary School in Vancouver, and I'm teaching remotely from Salt Spring Island right now. And I'd like to welcome you to this this webinar, and I look forward to showing you how these lessons are planned and how some of them have unfolded. So I'm just going to share a screen with you right now. Okay. So can everybody see the models that are up there? So this is the outline for the lessons, and I'm just going to do a brief overview of all of them, and then I'll go back and do some more detail in lesson 1. So you'll notice that they're sort of divided between the why and the how, and what we're really addressing here, the inquiry question: how did the contributions of Canadians help secure victory in Northwest Europe and the liberation of Holland in 1944-45? And by extension, why is it important to commemorate those Canadians who participated in that? And so to start off with, the question, you see the top 2 there, lesson 1 and 2, with high school students who sort of look upon the war as ancient history, and they see the frail old fellows in their uniforms or their blazers on Remembrance Day, and they don't really connect. And I think that the very first thing that is important with these lessons is it creates an imperative for the students to want to know more about it. So lesson 1 is all about what is the nature of contribution and sacrifice. And you can see here, this is a picture of the Pollard story map that's up on the wall. And I'll go into that in a few more, in just a minute, but it really addresses, it looks at current sort of celebrity Canadians, and then goes through, like, what does it mean to contribute? What does it mean to make a sacrifice? And then it circles around to Pollard. I'm going to click over to my next screen. Okay, and in the second lesson, the why translates to what was at stake. So it starts with a counterfactual argument, or question, which is what would happen to Canada if the Nazis were successful and had won the Second World War. And so it opens with focusing on the Heinz Kloss book that Library Archives Canada acquired recently, that has the outline of the individuals who were being targeted in North America. And then it moves into an analysis of, well, if that's what was at stake, what did it take to be a volunteer Canadian soldier? What sort of qualities would you have to have and what sort of qualities would you develop as you went into the battlefield and into Europe and that sort of thing. So between lessons 1 and 2, we're hoping to develop that, as I said, that sense of that imperative to do it. And I found success with that when we did it with the students. We bring in quite a few of the historical thinking concepts. This one's on comparing significance. We do a lot of work on cause-consequence and evidence analysis. If we jump back to the model here, so there's top through the bottom 3 here have more to do with, well, if there is an imperative to commemorate and recognize these actions and efforts, how do you do that? So lesson 3 is about designing a story map along the lines that would approximate what Project 44 has built, but in a student version. And so what they do to start with is they use the 7-sentence story structure, which is a way of writing out a narrative and giving them sort of a template to tell a story. And so we start off with that by breaking down the Mona Parsons story, and you can see here is used with another digital tool. And then they move over and they actually start to, they're going to look at one of those 6 focus Canadians on the Defining Moments Canada site. And then they start to build their own story with those personalities and the rich resources that are available on the site. And then in lesson 4, they actually build it and they share it. And this is using the Google Earth Tour version. And this is sort of what they would end up with at the end. And there's a whole process of giving each other feedback, and it ends up with a gallery walk where there's sort of that approximates a poster session at a conference. All of these tools can be, because of the rich media that's on the Defining Moments Canada site, it's sort of built for online already. However, we did create a new lesson 5, since the outbreak of COVID, which deals specifically with student creation or curation. And it's an exercise that doesn't have to be adapted to an online environment. It's already built as an online tool. So I'm going to stop sharing that screen, and I'm going to jump over to my other screen here and take you through lesson 1. So as I said, lesson 1 has to do with the nature of contribution and sacrifice. So what the students are asked to do is to sort of brainstorm what those 2 terms mean, and then think about how those are represented by 6 well-known Canadians: Julie Payette, Drake, Carey Price, Terry Fox, and from that they plot a chart. So what you can see here is here's a chart: personality 1, personality 2, and you can see that they create criteria by which they have to plot how they see the contribution and the sacrifice of those people. And then what they do is they do a deep dive into the background or information on the Defining Moments Canada site. So they go through into Mike's material, and they are reading through Canada's Finest Hour. They're reading through the other pages that are there. Before they do that, as just sort of an assessment of what their background knowledge is, we've included an editable quiz through Google Forms that the teachers can take and make their own, but it's ready to go here. And this will give teachers a background of what the students know already prior to looking through the background material. And then what they do is they jump over to, they jump over to the Project 44 site and zoom into the story map of George Pollard here. And at that point, they do an analysis of Pollard. They go through his story. of his the few days in between his landing at Normandy and his death and execution. And using the war diaries that are embedded in the Project 44 site, they're able to track his regiment. And in the end, they return back to this chart after doing the same exercise for him, after hearing his story and what he did and what his actions were. They come back and they plot the contribution and the sacrifice of George Pollard. And then there's some hard questions that they have to have a look at. Just one of the other activities that's in there is they get to see what an original war diary looks like, and they also have a glossary that is built into the side panel of the Defining Moments Canada site, and they go through and they have to decode the war diary so that they get an idea about how to do that, so they can actually track Pollard's regiment. And then there's various reflective questions that they have to address. For example, does considering personal sacrifice change your sense of their contribution to society? Why or why not? And so forth. What responsibility do Canadians have to remember the efforts and actions of individuals who contributed to the Allied victory in the Second World War? And so that sets the stage for them commemorative projects, digitally shareable. In this day and age, we have the ability to share these things, and that's an exciting new possibility for student commemoration. So I'd encourage you to have a look at those. As I said, the first four are adaptable very easily because they're already in a digital form, and the fifth one, which is coming on site soon, is ready-made for this period of COVID lockdown and is usable. So.
All right, I think I'm back. Well, thank you so very much to our Resource Roundtable panelists, and indeed to all of our panelists today for making this webinar possible. Let me get through some of this stuff. I needed to have this already set up. It was all of our backup in case something went wrong, as you can see. Too far. There we go. So we realize we've hit you with a lot of information and resources in a very short time today. So here's a quick resource recap. The main resources for this project live on Defining Moments Canada's website. That's definingmomentscanada.ca. The Juno Beach Center, we host a landing page for the 75th anniversary of Victory in Europe. That's at victory75.ca. There you'll find veteran testimonials and a link to our Maple Leaves and Tulips online exhibition that Mary-Eve mentioned earlier. Finally, the Canadian Research and Mapping Association hosts project44.ca. Their interactive web map, as you now know, includes the war diaries and data for most of the units in 1st Canadian Army. It's a great resource for anyone doing historical or genealogical research on Canadian veterans in these campaigns. And so with that, my role as webinar facilitator comes to an end. I will hand things back to Jen Terry of Defining Moments Canada for a final message and for the Q&A period.
Thank you, Alex. I'll let you keep your screen up there. Thank you. So if you haven't already asked your questions in that chat box there, go ahead and do it now, and we'll get through as many of them as we can. A quick final thought first. As he was traveling by Vimy Ridge in September of 1944 and broadcasting on Remembrance Day 1944, war correspondent Matthew Halton confronted the question of remembrance and commemoration. What are you going to do, he asked. Would we build another monument as tall as Vimy at Juno Beach to mark our dead? Would Canadian sons continue to follow in their father's footsteps each generation? Of course, we're going to remember the sacrifice, but so what? What will we make it mean? And I think his question is newly poignant today. Our tradition of remembrance and commemoration has once again been uprooted, not by war, but by a global pandemic. Mike, Mary-Eve, and Tim have all commented on this, and Tim made the great point that it's up to Canadians to tell our stories. We have to do it ourselves because no one else is going to do it for us, and that's what we are trying to equip our students with the tools to do. We hope that our discussion today has inspired you and that the resources we've showed you have made you interested to learn some more about these stories. Today, May 5th, is the National Liberation Day in the Netherlands, and VEday, Victory in Europe Day, is Friday, May 8th. The Juno Beach Centre, Defining Moments Canada, Project 44, Canadian War Museum, we're all going to continue to share these stories, and we hope that you will share your stories and your commemorative efforts with us too. I hope you'll tag us on social media, use the hashtag VEday75, or tell us how you'll be commemorating via email. We've left our contact information there. And as I've said a couple times, I will send out an email after this with a recording of this webinar, as well as links to all of the resources that we've discussed. So thanks again for everyone who's come. We'll start to go through some of the questions now. I think we have about maybe 20 minutes, and we'll just get through as many of them as we can. Mike, Mary Ev, and Tim, most of the questions are for you, so I'll pose them, and hopefully the three of you can kind of speak up when you think it's best that you are answering. Okay, so I'll just start. I'm just going to start where we got the first questions. I think Tim or Mary Ev mentioned that that proposed memorials for the Second World War had been planned, but obviously never happened. Are those plans or the ideas for those memorials available anywhere to be compared with First World War memorials that did get created?
Is this for memorials in Canada or overseas in the Netherlands? Both, I guess?
I guess both, yeah.
I do not know the full answers to this, actually.
I think it was I who brought it up. And as part of my new book, The Fight for History, I came across this amazing story of the Canadian Legion and Canadian veterans coming back from the war. And of course, we know very well about the Veterans Charter. We know about the reestablishment of Canadians. What we don't know, and which is not in books or published articles, is the story of the Canadian Second World War veterans and the debate over how we will remember the war. There was a fierce debate about maybe Remembrance Day should change. Veterans from the Second World War said, well, maybe Remembrance Day should be changed to 6 June. Others said, well, no, it should be 8 May. Others still said 15 August. There's quite a significant debate between First World War veterans and Second World War veterans, and obviously we know that they decided to keep Remembrance Day. They decided to keep the poppy, which was well established at that point. But what the Second World War veterans wanted was a new national memorial, and I recount this in my new book. And this was surprising to me, having studied a lot about the two world wars, to hear this story. The veterans came back and said, we understand you'll be building functional memorials, libraries and swimming pools and gardens, and that's what Canadians wanted. They didn't want another 4,000 local memorials and monuments, but they wanted a new national monument. And the Mackenzie King government was horrified by this. They had only unveiled the national monument in May of 1939, and they said no. And in fact, what Mackenzie King and the Liberal government said was that Ottawa, the beautification of Ottawa, would be a national memorial. Now, I live in Ottawa. I'd heard that before, but that was supposed to be the national monument. Now, of course, it didn't go over very well with the Royal Canadian Legion. It didn't go over well with many veterans. And the plans were died in 1946, although I have uncovered that in 1955, the Legion raised it again. And in 1957, the Diefenbaker government promised that there would be a new national memorial. And I've seen the architectural plans for this. It was to be built where the National Gallery is today, overlooking the Ottawa River. And it was supposed to be called the National Shrine of Remembrance. And it was to house the Book of Remembrance for the Second World War. It's where the Remembrance Day ceremonies were supposed to go forward. And for a number of reasons, it was canceled in 1966 or early 1967. So that's just one of the many stories I think that are out there about the ways that we struggle as Canadians to remember the Second World War. And one of the things I've argued in my book on Vimy and on this new one is, if you build a memorial, there's a stronger chance that people will remember, that there's a concrete structure of which we can attach our memories, our hopes, our dreams, our sorrow, our grief, all of that. But we haven't really done that for the Second World War or until quite recently.
Thank you. That was excellent. I think staying on the remembrance theme, I'm gonna let Mary-Eve answer this one. I think as the question was, it feels like we're further removed from the First World War connections today due to generational shift. Will a similar ongoing or current shift de-emphasize the Second World War, or will the story survive, and how, into our next generations? How do we make it a commonly held national memory that endures the passing of generations? How do we make commemoration appealing to young people? Mary-Eve?
She's muted.
Oh, you're muted, Mary-Eve.
I'm going to quote Jack Granatstein here and say that he's said that every history has to be rewritten for every new generation. So I think I'll echo what Tim and Mike have evoked as well, is that it's up to us to redo it. And each decade brings on, you know, a new version of our history. So it's refined. We as Tim has mentioned, sometimes it tears us apart because we have new things to argue over, and we deconstruct the myths that we build with each generation. So I think that every new generation comes to this with very fresh eyes, and they quickly, as any teacher in a classroom will experience, they quickly question, and they come at it from an angle of having the benefit of hindsight. It's up to us to make it make sense. But recently I was discussing with a group of Carleton MBA students who've been helping the Juno Beach Center with social media, and they say that they've seen their nephews who are 12, 13 years of age repost and reshare very short stories of Holocaust survivors on Instagram. And I was like, really, they do that? And I was quite impressed. So when things make sense to young people, they're very quick to act on it. And if it's not overwhelming and it doesn't feel like an encyclopedia has to be digested, they grab onto the meaning very fast. And I think that's an advantage of the newer generations, is that they analyze content so fast that we have to trust them that they get it really quickly, especially if it's served to them in these shorter videos. And I was very, I guess I felt comforted in the fact that young teenagers get it, and they take the initiative of resharing it on Instagram. So it's up to us to find out how their brains work and how they learn and adapt to that. And then they will own that history in their own way. Each generation comes studying this military history from different perspectives, different angles. And I think that's what makes it so diverse, so vibrant, so rich, and so unkillable in a sense. So I saw comments about it's every new decade has its new challenge, and it's up to a newer generation. When I was in my 20s, Jack Granatstein was a major figure. Now Tim Cook, Mike Bechtold are new major figures, and so it's up to us to transmit in a shorter time frame. For my generation, I think it's our jobs to really understand how kids learn and think, to transmit it and convert the try, really sort of rugby talk here. But that's my perspective on that question. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. Mike, we had a question about the role of the Air Force during the Netherlands campaign. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. The Air Force was absolutely important in what was going on. Thanks, Pat, for that question. I know your father flew B-25s in Northwest Europe, and thank you for his service there. The current project we have is focused on the liberation of the Netherlands, and that's primarily an army story.
Of course, 2nd Tactical Air Force, which had quite a number of Canadian squadrons, were there and playing an important role. But that's not really the focus of this project. However, in the wider story, the Air Force was absolutely crucial. Of course, there was the 6th Group of the RCAF, part of RAF Bomber Command, that was taking the war right to Germany, attacking oil plants, attacking cities, attacking the way the Germans could support the war effort. And it's a very controversial part of the Second World War. It's certainly been debated endlessly, but I think it's safe to say that the strategic bombing offensive, as it's known, was a key part in destroying the Germans' ability to wage war, and the Canadians were front and center in that. The fighter squadrons were playing an important role in dealing with German fighter aircraft, in providing tactical air support for the armies. Coastal command squadrons were dealing with the German Navy at sea, whether it be in the North Sea and the English Channel, where there were E-boats and German transports that they were going after, or over the North Atlantic, where, even though the Battle of the Atlantic had largely been won, and I'll put that in quotation marks, by 1943, there was certainly still a serious war being fought there. The Germans had lots of U-boats that were out there that had to be stopped so that they didn't interfere with the Allied transports that were going from North America to the United Kingdom. So yeah, absolutely, the Air Force had a key role to play, and just the nature of this webinar meant that it wasn't the focus of what we're talking about today. The same could be said for the Navy. The Navy was in Northwest Europe supporting operations. They were making sure that the English Channel and the North Sea were free so that we could get back and forth from England to continental Europe. And there wasn't anything going to be done by the German U-boats. And again, the Battle of the Atlantic was still waging in the North Sea, North Atlantic. So yeah, those are other parts, and there's countless other parts of the Second World War that we weren't able to focus on in this short seminar, but were equally important to achieving final victory. I'll throw it back to you, Jen.
Make sure you unmute yourself, Jen.
Sorry about that. Thank you. We have gotten a ton of questions, and I really appreciate that. So I just wanted to say that if you've asked a question sort of specific to your own father's story, your own grandfather's story, and how you can learn more about that, I will include some information of how to start that research in the email that we send out afterwards, just so that we can keep it to some more general questions. I'm just trying to decide where we should go first, or we should go next. Okay, we've got two questions sort of about replacement infantry and armored troops. So I'll read what we have here, and then Alex, maybe you can tell me who might be best to answer this. Can someone touch on the shortage of replacement infantry and armored troops by the spring of 1945? I've read there were at least the equivalent of 4 to 6 divisions of healthy Canadian troops who were drafted but didn't volunteer for overseas services. And if so many of the troops liberating the Netherlands were reinforcements and replacements in a depleted Canadian army, what was the margin that made the difference in Canadians delivering victory over a desperately retreating German army?
I can certainly speak here. I can start on that, and maybe Tim or Mary-Ev want to come in as well. The reinforcement issue was certainly a very big one in the Second World War. Early on, the Canadians had more than enough men and officers to fill out the ranks of the Canadian Army, so much so that we loaned hundreds of Canadian officers to the British Army. It was a program known as the Can Loan program, so that these Canadian officers served with British regiments in Normandy, in Northwest Europe, in Italy, and so forth. Later in the war, after the Normandy campaign and casualties got quite high, the number of reinforcements became very difficult to keep that stream of infantrymen. There was lots of soldiers in the Canadian Army, but the Army had misplanned, and they were in the wrong branches. They were in service branches. They were in the artillery. They weren't artillerymen, which was really needed. Conn Smythe, the famous Toronto Maple Leaf owner, was a colonel major in a light anti-aircraft regiment in Normandy. He was wounded. and went home after the Normandy campaign, and he made a really big stink back in Canada saying that we needed to send our conscripts overseas. The conscripts had been part of the Canadian Army since the beginning of the war, but Mackenzie King, the Canadian Prime Minister, had famously said conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. And those conscripts were only for service in Canada. They couldn't be sent lawfully overseas to fight in the war. So there was this big pool of resources that wasn't being used. So it created a problem, and eventually it was all worked out. Conscription for overseas service was okayed. They were sent overseas. And while the numbers were small, they made an absolutely crucial contribution to the fighting infantry units at the front, in that the number of conscripts kept those units up to full state. They kept them in the fight. They kept them going forward. So yeah, it's a big issue, and we could talk for quite a bit longer on it. Tim, did you want to jump in?
No, I think you've said it nicely there, Mike. I guess the second part of the question was, what made the Canadians so effective, or how were they able to keep beating the Germans? And I think the battles of 1945 are little understood in Canada. Again, I think that many Canadians maybe know about D-Day and the liberation of the Dutch, but they much harder time understanding the importance of the Scheldt campaign in October and November of 1944, which is absolutely crucial to the Allied war effort in opening up Antwerp, and just absolutely brutal fighting there in conditions that were unthinkable, unspeakable. And the big battles of 1945 are little understood as well. There's a parallel there maybe to 1918 with the Canadian Corps, where we've often focused on Vimy and Passchendaele, but not on Amiens and Arras and capturing Cambrai, the key battles of the 100 Days. There's something maybe about the fatigue of historians when they get to the end of these wars and they have challenges writing about them. But certainly by 1945, the 1st Canadian Army was a very effective fighting formation. Very strong combined arms warfare, the use of air power, all of these key features steadily driving the Germans back. And yet it was never easy to win on the Western Front from 1915 to 1918 or 1944, 1945. The Germans were resilient and effective, and when they were fighting on the defensive, they fought very hard. And every battle in February and March of 45 was really costly. And as Mike alluded to earlier, why did the bombing campaign continue? It was because tens of thousands of Allied soldiers were dying in those final weeks of the war. But in the end, I do think that those battles in February and March of 45 are absolutely crucial, as are the battles of April 1945, when the Canadians really begin to liberate the Dutch and at least some forces fighting into Germany still.
Yeah, no, it goes back to the burn rate we were describing earlier. By the time we get to Normandy in 1944, there's been a lot of commitments and engagements in other arenas. So if you stretch that to 1945, with a population of our size, as Tim has mentioned, 11 million people, I'm kind of amazed that this question comes through, because it's like we really did, when that journalist, Tim, said, you know, are you sure that we had 1.1 that burn rate explains the ferocity of the fighting, and the reinforcements crisis. I think we have to also take into account the battle exhaustion rates, because of the nature of the fighting and the lengthy fighting. We have units that have been fighting since D-Day, you know, by March of 1945. So the battle exhaustion rates go up quite a bit. In fact, in our online exhibition, I call the Canadian Army the biggest of the smallest of the Allied armies. We have under our command British troops, American troops, strangely enough, but also the Poles, the Czechs, the Belgians, and the Dutch. Some regiments are fully integrated into our fighting force. Not necessarily just to make up for our lack of reinforcements, but because we are the agile army, much like in 1918, where it's easier for us to integrate as a medium-sized army some foreign troops who need to contribute and be involved in the liberation. That aspect is often overlooked, and it shows that it goes to show that, again, as I've said before, we punched above our weight, in my opinion, during the Second World War.
Thank you. We'll do 2 quick questions left. Drew, if you're still here, we had a couple questions about the Project 44 maps. I wonder if you could comment on sort of, if there's a simple way to do it, the software that you use to develop them, and what the future plans are for them. Will you be working with other organizations to expand what you have? Are you focused on other parts of the war? That sort of thing.
Yeah, no, for sure. Thanks for the questions from our attendees. Project 44 is always interested in collaborating with other organizations in terms of dissemination of Canadian military history. You just need to sort of reach out and, provide a little bit of an elaborate explanation over what's possible, and we can for sure meet you halfway. And when it comes to the software we used, I saw somebody asked a question if we use ArcGIS story maps. Unfortunately, we don't. We use open source Mapbox, and we have a really good developer who specializes in programming with maps. So, the ArcGIS is definitely industry standard. That's what Nathan and I use to do all the mapping. But the thing is, economically, you can get quite pricey with Esri products. So we're trying to go the open source route and trying to keep this data accessible to all of Canadians without having to justify a reason to charge for any of the stuff that's on the website. I hope that answers the question.
The other side of it, Drew, is what are your plans for the future?
The plans for the future is a great question. Next year, we're going to set our sights, knock on wood, for the Italian campaign, because that's a campaign that's often overlooked. I know on our web map now we have one corps that participated in Operation Goldflake. They came up late February 45, early March 45. You can see those units pile in from I think they drove from Marseille all the way to Belgium, where they sort of biovac'd for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then moved into fighting in the liberation of Holland. But so next year is going to be the Italian campaign, one corps mapping, and then Nathan and I are still sort of discussing this, but I'd like to see a Forgotten Fronts project talking about Hong Kong, as Mike mentioned, the Aleutian Islands campaign. These are all sort of distant memories when we look at D-Day or the Battle of the Scheldt or Dieppe. There's a lot of commemoration that needs to be working on in terms of trying to get all of those fronts together in one spot, so that Canadians don't get sort of inundated with too much information about D-Day or the liberation of Holland, because there's so much out there. And as we were mentioning before, over 1 million Canadians served during the Second World War, but not all those 1 million served in Northwest Europe. So I hope that answers the question, but definitely cites our Italian campaign and then Forgotten Fronts. We'll have to see how hard it is to dig up documents from the Siege of Hong Kong, but I know that there's maps from the Battle of Hong Kong in the library and archives, so that's a good start.
Fantastic. Thanks, Drew. We'll finish up with just one last question that's been asked in a few ways by a bunch of people. A lot of the commemorations this year for VEday 75 have been pushed to next year, VEday 75 +1. But more immediately, I wonder if any of our historian panelists want to comment on what they think Remembrance Day this year might look like, assuming that we will still be at least partially on lockdown. Anyone want to take the chance? I know it's a lot to ask.
There was just a ceremony in Toronto for fallen police officers, and it might provide a model for how Remembrance Day services might be going forward. They had a live event on the scene. They had pipers, they had a speaker, but they told everybody to stay home, and it was live streamed. So there was a live event that was then broadcast out to everybody else so that they could take part in it from the safety of their homes. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see some sort of hybrid ceremony like that on the 11th of November.
Thanks, Mike. I think that just about wraps us up, everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us. We really enjoyed doing this, and I hope that we will be able to continue having conversations with our audiences this way. Like I said, if your question didn't get answered, we will try to send some more answers in an email in just a little while when I circulate the recording of the webinar and all of the resources we've talked about. There was some really great discussion happening in the chats. I love to see everyone sharing their stories. So thank you so much for participating in this digital commemoration with us. And I hope that you take some time on Friday to remember the significance of VEday that day. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Stay safe.
Yes, stay safe.